Hello, and welcome to the weekly sermon podcast with Reverend Marie Duquette. You can find the full live version service on YouTube's Be Ye Lifted.
The Holy Gospel according to Matthew chapter 5.
Glory to you, O Lord.
And the bold-faced print is not a mistake. That's where you come in. Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. I'm going to actually bring a word of the Lord from our very first reading today, which seems like a long time ago. We've had a lot of words between now and then. So I want to refresh your memory by reading just the ending of Isaiah 58 that you heard. And I'm reading from the African American Devotional Bible in light of it being African American History Month. Verse 11, chapter 58 of Isaiah. "The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings." I am partial to that last verse, verse 12. "Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in." According to AAA, U.S. drivers spend nearly $3 billion a year fixing damage caused by potholes. And a recent report conducted by Insurance News concluded that Michigan has the worst potholes in the nation. We're number one. And while the process by which it was determined that Michigan is number one in potholed roads is suspect, it's hard to argue that surely we must be near the top of the list when even the parking lot in front of Macy's at Briarwood Mall has potholes in which a small dog could disappear for good. When I Googled, how bad are Michigan roads, I found out they are so bad, thank you, Madeline, that we have a local band named Michigan Roads. Their promotional graphic is a pothole filled with fresh tar with real Michigan street names in the picture. Michigan Roads is playing at a pub in Canton this month. You might think of the book of Isaiah as both a trilogy and a group project. The 3 books had different writers. Isaiah 58 is in the 3rd book in the trilogy. It speaks about the time when the Jewish people were finally released from exile, where they had been held captive for close to 50 years. Now free to return to their homeland, there was no small amount of rebuilding that needed to happen, including the rebuilding of their beloved temple and the roads to get to it. When Russia attacked Ukraine 1 year ago, and we watched cities in Ukraine being destroyed almost daily, I remember thinking, who and how will they ever rebuild after such destruction? This is what Isaiah 58 is about. Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. In the process of rebuilding, the Jewish people would next live through famine, failed crops, drought, and internal strife, aka bickering. Can you imagine? And just as before the exile, there was a lack of justice as steady as the sound of hammers in the process of rebuilding. And then, as now, a central question at the heart of this reading is, how is God present amid so much misery, poverty, injustice, and infighting? God's presence in Isaiah 58 should be understood in terms of God's justice that runs like a golden thread throughout the trilogy that is Isaiah. In the first book, we read about God's anger at a people who confused justice with bloodshed, righteousness with an outcry. In the reality of bloodshed and outcry, the image of a God who hears the victim's cries and is not blind to the injustices of those most vulnerable is a reminder of the claim that God is exalted in justice. In the second book of the trilogy, chapter 42, we hear about God's servant, either an individual or the community as a whole, being charged with the call to bring forth justice. The servant is called, quote, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison, those who sit in darkness. And today in Isaiah 58, the prophet writing in the name of his predecessors is deeply frustrated that people's priorities are skewed. The people appear to be deeply religious, seeking God, delighting in God's ways, and drawing near to God. But their actions show a severe disconnect between what they believe about God and the way they act. As people newly released from exile, they're yearning for God's presence. They think they are seeking God's ways, and they engage in religious activities such as regular fasting. And God's response to that is a resounding no. Attention to holy rituals does not take precedence over how you treat one another, says the Lord. The reason why God is not impressed with their religious activities is that their fasting is entirely self-serving. They may observe fast days, but they're guilty of oppressing their workers, and they're guilty of living in discord with their neighbors. Worst of all is that they neglect those who have real needs in their community, the hungry, the homeless, and those who lack adequate clothing. Poverty has become a yoke crushing the poor. The bonds of injustice make it impossible to escape. God is giving new meaning to what constitutes justice and faithfulness. God's idea of an act of devotion is to break the yoke of injustice and untangle the elements that keep such a yoke in its place. To do justice is about removing all the barriers that weigh people down, feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, clothing the naked. In Isaiah 58, there's a clear connection between justice and liberation and God's presence. Sally McFaig famously said, "If God is absent from this world, it is because we are." Conversely, whenever people take up their vocation to see justice, to tend to those who suffer, God's presence breaks into the world. As in verse 8, which says, God's glory will be a rear guard to you, a source of protection against forces that pursue from behind. In verse 12, people are called to be repairers of the breach and restorers of the streets. It's almost like the prophet is saying, yes, I know you must rebuild homes, places of business, the temple, even the roads you will traverse to get to these places. And while you are doing that heavy lifting, don't forget that justice itself needs an overhaul as well. My question for us today is the same. As we work to rebuild our community of faith, looking at the budget, our expenses, the maintenance of a building that was left nearly empty for 2 years, as we strive not to be overwhelmed by all the necessary actions that are required to get King of Kings fully on its feet again, we can't forget why we are doing this work to begin with. Justice must be incorporated into all that we do. And I'm not just talking about the big justice, working to end poverty. I'm talking about smaller injustices, the way we treat our family, our friends, one another. Sadly, God is not impressed with the sound of our music, the depth of our prayers, or the regularity of our worship if we are not working for justice for ourselves and those well beyond the walls of this church. Perhaps a good way to ensure that we do not prioritize, say, the budget and the rebuilding over relationships that are also broken simply from being apart is to think about injustice as a pothole. You knew I would come back to it. There you are, cruising along on your way to work when, bam, a pothole catches you unaware, slowing you right down and possibly costing you money. It's the same way when we gather for meetings, but do not acknowledge the way people in those meetings are hurting. When we plow forward without acknowledging people's pain, we deny the dignity and grace that Jesus routinely modeled and now today requires of those who follow him. Cole Arthur Riley is a young African-American modern-day prophet. Because of her lack of protection from immunities, she was completely isolated for most of the pandemic. And during that time, she wrote her first book, This Here Flesh. In it, she writes, "What do we do once the curse is lifted but the damage is untouched? When justice is had and the swords are beaten into plowshares, but everyone's wounds are still bleeding in the open, what then? Justice doesn't survive without repair. We have to pause and bandage ourselves up habitually. Even when the oppressor has been defeated, we are worthy of tending to the pain of the past. Repair, truth-telling, reparations, healing, reconciliation. These are what breathe new life into us. Maybe that should be something we incorporate into our meetings and our gatherings, even our family gatherings, so that we do not merely rebuild the physical, replacing our air conditioning, getting a new mailbox to replace the one we have in which the door is hanging on by one tiny screw, but unless you get the mail all the time, you might not know that. Reconciling our finances. We also need to repair the breaches, the gaps between what is, what should be, and what is. The breaches, the gaps between what should be and what is. Truth-telling, reparations, healing, reconciliation, these are what breathe new life into us. This is where we see God working. When we tend to breaches in relationships, injustices, aspects of life and community that do not reflect God's love, then the light will dawn upon us, whether we do it well or whether we are just beginners doing it awkwardly. When we normalize making space to talk about how we are hurting and who we are hurting, and we seek to repair, however awkwardly, our relationships with the earth and with one another, then we witness the prophecy of verses 11 and 12 in Isaiah 58. The Lord will guide you continually. The Lord will satisfy your needs in parched places and make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water whose waters never fail. Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in.
You just heard from Reverend Marie Duquette, pastor at King of Kings in Ann Arbor, Michigan. You can help support this ministry by texting your contribution to 833-950-1405. That's the U.S. 833-950-1405. You can find the full service video on YouTube Live at BE Lifted. Drop us a comment or join us on live chat at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time Sunday mornings.